Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the speaker, look at me, to the Forum on the Hill, formerly the speaker series. It's so nice to see you all today. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Angela Saavedra, the director of the Center on the Hill. I'm so very happy to see you all here. It is my great pleasure to be introducing this month's speaker, Eric Corson. Born in Minnesota, Eric grew up in Queens, New York. In 1967, while the Vietnam War was raging, Eric applied for conscientious objector status and received it. So instead of serving in the military, he was allowed to do 2 years of alternative service working with the American Friends Service Committee in Columbus, Ohio. In that job, he visited many young men who were in prison for refusing to fight in Vietnam. Eric came to Philadelphia in 1977 to take over the directorship of PVS, which is headquartered here, overseeing about 400 volunteer visitors who come from all walks of life. It is my great pleasure to introduce Eric Corson.
Well, thank you for coming out, it's my privilege to be here. It's very interesting for my life, starting out in one way and then ending up in a very different way. Growing up in New York City, and all the cultural stuff there, and going to music and dance and everything like that, and I wound up actually going to New York University majoring in music and teaching music. And that's what I was doing until I went out to Ohio to visit my stepsisters, my half-sisters, and my father's second marriage. And they were going to a Quaker meeting house. I had no idea about Quakerism then. And I started going there, and I found that to be very eye-opening about the nature of worship, silent meeting for worship. And that greatly influenced me. And as the Vietnam War continued and so on, that Quaker influence on me caused me to eventually decide to declare myself as a conscientious objector. I had a teaching deferment, but I gave it up and decided to declare myself a conscientious objector, and then had the hearing with the draft board and so on, and they finally agreed to give me that, and then I had to do 2 years of alternative service in lieu of the military. And I went out to Columbus, Ohio. The selective service at that time had a policy. It wasn't law, but it was their policy that for conscientious objectors, that you needed to go and be at least 50 miles from your home community to try and make it somewhat similar to what people would go into the military, and they would wind up being hundreds of miles from their home. That was a policy. So I figured 50 miles, 500 miles, what's the difference? And I went out to Columbus and did that. And it really, really turned my life around. Because the Quaker meeting house where I was working with the American Friends Service Committee, it was really the center in Columbus of the whole peace movement and so on. Quakers being a peace church. At the meeting house, we would get phone calls from people whose families members, either their son or their husband, were winding up being locked up in the local jail, in the county jail, or in the workhouse. And so I was designated by the meeting, because of my interest, to go and visit these people in the local jails. I had never been in prison, never been in jail before. And I started going in there and visiting these people. And I said, this is a very interesting world. So that's what started me off, to have a very different work in my life, going from music to prison. And so eventually I met Faye Honeyknop, who was one of the co-founders of Prisoner Visitation Support, PVS. And she was a very unique person. And she told me about this opening. This was after 6 years of being in Columbus, in Philadelphia. And I applied and came in and was interviewed, and they asked me, could I commit to a 2-year commitment? And I thought about it for a while, and finally said, okay, and I wound up doing that for 40 years. And because it was such an amazing job and an amazing experience. The volunteers are incredible people, all volunteering, coming from different walks of life. One of them is sitting here, and they're just amazing people who don't get paid, could be doing lots of other things. If you're visiting in prison, especially as volunteers even, you have so many things that you have to deal with. You have to know the rules, you have to make sure that you just do things correctly and all that stuff, or they don't let you in. And people could be volunteering and doing lots of other things which frankly would just be a lot easier than having to deal with the whole question in being in prison. And having to deal with various personalities of prisoners, some of them very quiet and polite, others more raucous, and having different things to do. So anyway, I spent 40 years being in charge of the program, and all these volunteers all across the country, because this is a program that visits prisoners in federal and military prisons across the country. So in Philadelphia, there's the detention center down at 6th and Arch. That's the only facility in Philadelphia that's federal. And then there are 122 federal prisons across the country. And then there are a few military prisons. And so, meeting with these people, working with them and so on, year after year for 40 years, when I knew I was going to retire, I really got concerned because I knew I was going to have withdrawal from these people. They're all amazing human beings who go in and volunteer their time to visit prisoners and people that they don't know at all, the total strangers. And so I made a decision to deal with that. I went and did a farewell tour across the country. I spent about 2.5 years doing that. Mostly by train, interestingly enough. I went down the East Coast, flew to the West Coast, went down the West Coast, did some in the Midwest and so on. It was wonderful. I had my phone and my little microphone, and I interviewed people, over 100 of the volunteers, to say, tell me, how long did you visit? Why did you want to visit? What prompted you? And tell me some stories of visits that were very special to you, good or bad. And so I had all that, and then I, of course, wound up spending about 5 months editing that, and then finally producing the book. So that's how I got to be able to be here and speak and have the book and so on. So what I'd like to do is just read a few of the stories from the visitors to you, and then open it up for questions from you. So just permit me to read a few. I'm always moved by the visitors and their stories. Okay. This is from Terry. I visited somebody who sobbed, absolutely cried and cried and cried for 2 hours. And then it was time for me to leave, and all I could say to her was to hang on. She had 2 children, and nobody was taking care of them. She was an interesting person, and in the end, did lots of work on her case. Finally, she got a judge in Baltimore to take a second look at her case. She never cried again and got much stronger. I think she's out now. One of the prisoners I visited was Andrew from California. Oh, wait, that's the wrong page. Sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've been visiting at FCI Allenwood here in Pennsylvania for over 10 years. Often people ask me, why do you do this? I have various answers, but one I share is something that happened the very first time I visited. I was sitting across from the prisoner, and I said something. I don't even remember now what I said. And he started to cry. I thought I said something wrong, and I said, have I offended you in some way? He composed himself and said, no, you didn't offend me at all. I've been in here for 7 years, and you're the first person from the outside that I've seen. And I was hooked. This is from Gary in Florida. I've been a PVS visitor for over 10 years. PVS has given the opportunity for myself and others to go into the prisons and have conversations with prisoners on a one-to-one basis. Every time I go, I always feel lifted up, even though I may hear some not too good things. But I feel encouraged because I feel like I've made a difference in a person's life. Prisoners have told me things they wouldn't tell anybody else. I encourage them and try to help build them up, help give them some hope and think about the future. And that's important to me, to give people hope. I'm firmly convinced that one prisoner I saw was on the verge of taking his life. I'll never forget being with him that day. He was so very despondent, and it was taking everything I had to use wise counsel to him to help him think about life and living. I remember going back the next month to see him, and he was like a changed person. He said, I wasn't really going to take my life, but I was really down, and you came in that day. That one visit helped me get through the day. And when I got through that day, I could get through the next day. He was one of those prisoners whose life was bad. His father was in prison, his family had deserted him, and he wasn't getting any visits. I truly felt like I made a difference. This is from Ina, down in West Virginia. An officer at the entrance desk once asked me why I visited strangers in prison. I told him, I don't want anyone to be forgotten. The simplest answer I could give. Yeah. This is from Jeannie. And then there's the PVS Miracle Story. At the PVS Visitor Conference, every year there would be a national conference for the volunteers. This one was in Colorado. We had a group visit to FCC Florence, Colorado. All the PVS visitors were herded into this very large visiting room. The prisoners would come out the door in ones and twos, and the visitors would go after them. And I thought, Jeannie, if you're going to get somebody to visit you, better not just sit here in the chair. You better get up, go up and get one. So the next time I saw somebody come through the door, I walked up and said, hi, I'm Jeannie Graves, and I'm a PVS visitor. Would you like a visit? And he said, Jeannie Graves? And I'm thinking, my goodness, has my name gotten around the prison system? Anyway, I said, yes, Jeannie Graves. And he said, you visited me in Los Angeles. And I always thought I would see you again because I remember one time leaving a visit with you and thinking to myself, she treats me like a person. So why am I acting like an animal? So I started to help other prisoners learn to read and to write their legal papers. And I learned to crochet and made toys for children. The visits from you really changed my life. All right. Oh, this one is really something. From Joyce out in Illinois. My favorite visiting experience was with a woman whose hand reached down towards the floor as if to pick up something. I asked her why she reached down. She replied, "Oh, I was looking for my purse. I enjoyed our conversation so much that I thought I was on the outside." You just can't make up things like this. It's just amazing, at least to me. All right. One of the things that kept me visiting was the experience with this one prisoner who was in the special housing unit, which is solitary. This is in Atlanta. At one of the visits, he's already on the side of the booth, but the lights are turned off and he's got his head down on his arms. I tap on the glass and pick up the phone, and he picks up the phone but doesn't lift his head. I said, "You're not looking very good today." He says, "I'm not feeling very good. I didn't get any sleep last night." And I said, "It's up to you. You can leave or I'll sit here and you can sleep." And he says, "Just tell me what you did this last month. These visits are the only thing that's keeping me going." Apparently, he was locked in this special housing unit, solitary, not because he had done anything wrong, but because somebody tried to kill him. He had 6 months until release, so that's how our visits went. I would go in and tell him about my pretty boring life and what I had done during each month. I think this is the last one. One of my first visiting experiences convinced me that I'll never stop visiting. This guy came out and was extremely shy. He was just sitting there looking down at his feet and didn't know what to do. I said, "I'm Terry and I'm here to visit." And he said, "I haven't had a visit in 12 years. It just blew my mind. The idea that this was the first positive contact he'd had with a human being got to me. I'll never forget that. So those are just a few of the things that people shared. And it was so amazing in interviewing people. Sometimes they were individuals, other times it was in a group because of the people who were, there were 3, 4, 5 visitors who visited that particular prison. And it was just so astounding to have them just share these experiences of visiting, just simply going in, having no idea necessarily of what was going to happen, what were people going to say or whatever. And so these are just a few of the experiences that I find that the visitors have had. They're just really extraordinary people when they go in to visit. Again, they're not getting paid, and they have to deal with the prison officials and all the rules and regulations that go in there. You can't just wear any kind of clothes. You can't wear khaki, because the prisoners wear khaki. You can't wear, certain type blouses. You have to, the shoes, you can't have any open-toed shoes, because prisoners have sometimes secreted things, or the people from the outside do drugs or whatever. You just, you have to know all the rules. There is no excuse that, if you don't know the rule and something happens, that's too bad. You're out. And of course, we understand the officials need to be very careful about security, of course. But anyway, these individuals who go in month after month, once a month to visit people, are extraordinary people. And I felt very privileged to have worked with these folks. And I feel especially blessed that a good number of them still keep in touch with me, whether they're still current visitors or they're former visitors. And I'll get phone calls occasionally, I'll get texts, emails, and it's a real privilege and so on to have done this for all these years. So at this point, I'd like to open it to questions if people have questions. And yeah.
I have a couple. Do you have special training for these visitors?
Yes. And of course, now I'm not part of the organization anymore. Obviously, I retired. But yes, oh, for sure. So they're just in interviewing people to be a visitor. Just because somebody wants to be a visitor, it doesn't mean they're going to be appointed as a visitor. Because there are various reasons for why people want to visit. People need to be mature. They need to, just be careful about what they're doing. As far as one of the questions that is always asked of people is, do you have any problem saying no to people? And that's a real core question, because prisoners, some of them, are going to check you out, and try and see if they can get something. Oh, would you call my wife? Would you call my lawyer? This or whatever. Which as a volunteer you cannot do any of that stuff. So that's one of the questions, just in the interview. To establish that you're not just going into some old place, you're going into prison with rules and so on, and you need to be cognizant of people. Most prisoners are not trying to pull anything over on you, but there are enough of them who do that you have to be careful and aware of that. After that, if you're going to be appointed as a visitor, then there's training, and if you, for example, there's a whole training manual that you receive. If you are if there are other visitors who visit also at that prison, you have somebody who's the coordinator who sits down with you and goes in, and in fact, there's always an experienced visitor to take you in for your first visit, because you go in and you don't know, even if you've been schooled in it, what you expect. So you go in with an experienced visitor, and that's very helpful. And then there are these national training workshops, and people go to that, and they're in different parts of the country once a year. And they're amazing experiences, because you have people from all across the country who are visiting, and they get to meet each other. And in some cases, they even, somebody's visited somebody at one prison, let's say, on the East Coast, and they meet somebody who the prisoner's been transferred, because in the federal prison system, they transfer people all over the place, all the time. And somebody will say, "Oh, you're now visiting so-and-so, out there," and they get to go, "Oh, that's great, tell them hi from me." So you have that kind of training. It's very important. Without the training, it would really be disaster. And frankly, there are people who go in to visit, either through chaplains or whatever, or through other groups, and they mess up. They do things that they're not supposed to do, and they get kicked out, and this does not happen within this organization. People do not get kicked out because of all the screening and training that's done.
About how long is this training? And where is it done?
Well, it's if you're talking about just the individual thing, there isn't any length thing. As far as the training for the conference that happens once a year, that's a 4-day conference, and that's in various parts of the country. But that's all already after people have been appointed as a visitor. This is not beforehand. Beforehand, it's just individuals where a experienced visitor is sitting down with the new visitor, taking them in for their first visit, or even several visits in that regard. But the conference is something very special when people can go to that, and you can have anywhere from 80 to 120 people gathering in a particular area. And it's always near a federal or military prison, And they do, like Jeannie described in the book, where they went in, and there she wound up, seeing this prisoner who she had visited in Los Angeles, and was able to renew the acquaintances for that time.
Are the visits with the prisoners always one-on-one? You don't ever like have two volunteers with one prisoner?
I would say 99% of the time it's one-on-one. The only exceptions to that, and I don't know if exceptions is really the right word, that there are some people, some couples who go in and, they're both, most cases, one person, from a couple visits and the other person's not interested or whatever. But there are occasionally some couples who visit together. Usually they'll each separate and visit one person separately. But occasionally there have been times when a couple is visiting with a singular prisoner. And that can be really, really neat, especially for prisoners who have never experienced positive things about relationships. And they see these two, these two people in the couple relating, to him or her and to each other in a way. So that can be really pretty neat. That's not, well, it's common enough, but mostly it's one-on-one. But occasionally it's two-on-one.
And does the volunteer always visit the same prisoner when they go on a visit?
For the most part, but not always. And it isn't just usually one prisoner. I mean, there are lots of prisoners who don't get visits. And so a visitor will go in each month and they may have 3, 4, or 5 people on their list. And they will see one for an hour, and then the next person's called out and they'll see the next person, and so on. So they may get to see 3, 4, 5 people in a day, and you can imagine that can be very tiring at the end of the day, but these people do that.
Do the prisoners volunteer to receive visits, and if so,
You
are
mean-
they screened in some way before they're paired up with a visitor?
They're not screened, but prisoners either write to the organization in Philadelphia to say I'd like a visit, or they tell staff that they want to be visited. There's certainly not a way where we're gonna, or people are gonna say we're gonna visit this person. They need to initiate that, but they can be referred. Sometimes staff make referrals. I had a very interesting experience many years ago when I was going up to USP Allenwood, not the camp that used to be, but the high security penitentiary in Williamsport, or near Williamsport. And the warden and chaplain knew I was coming up that day. And they asked me to visit somebody to add to the list. This was a prisoner who had not had a visitor in 32 years. And the warden, knew me and knew he could trust me and so on, and the chaplain as well, who was a really neat chaplain. And so there was a referral. I wound up visiting this guy because it was referred by the warden, because he understood how important visits could be. This prisoner, by the way, could not deal with being in the visiting room. He had never been in the visiting room. And it was very difficult for him to be in the visiting room, with the noise, the children, and all that kind of stuff. So staff will sometimes, if they really understand how important these visits are, will also make referrals. But it mostly comes from the prisoners asking for the visits. Yeah. Yes.
Is it male to male, female to female, or is it whatever?
It's whatever. But, of course, the whole idea of screening people and appointing only people that we feel are good is why we can do that. Now, I know of programs. I remember when I was in Minnesota and I was visiting the director of this state program, a very good state program there, and she was shocked to hear that we had women visiting men, men visiting women, men visiting men, women visiting women, because their program did not allow for opposite sex visiting. They were just too afraid of what could happen. But I think if you have good recruitment and training and so on, you know, you're finding these really gems and these people who you don't have to worry about that at all. But it's very important that you have the quality control of these volunteers, for sure. Yes?
Do you visit any prisoner, or do you make exceptions for, say, murderers or rapists or things?
Anybody who wants to visit. Now, having said that, I would certainly not put a brand new volunteer starting out visiting someone who committed murder. That would not be a good way to start things out. But the other thing is that in most cases, we never ask prisoners why they're in there. You know, if they want to say why they're in there, they will. And most of them eventually, over time, will tell you why. But we don't ask why they're in. So in most cases, we don't even know, at least to start out, you know, what their offense was. Occasionally we will know that, which is, I think, is a good thing, because it means it's putting the onus on the prisoner to be able to, if he or she wants to share about him or herself, and that they can feel comfortable. I think one of the things, for example, prisoners or sex offenders who have committed some sex crimes, they're very paranoid about sharing anything about that within the prison, because that is looked upon as not a very good thing. For somebody to feel, after a while, confident enough with their visitor to tell them something about that is a pretty amazing thing. You have to add to the fact that there are microphones in the visiting room, and while they cannot monitor everything, there's no way they can monitor 100% of the conversations, but you don't know when things are being monitored. I'll give you an example. I visited at USP Marion, Illinois, which used to be the Supermax, the most secure prison in the country. Now it's in Florence, Colorado, is the Supermax, specially built for that. So I once was out there and I was visiting. You know, you go in, there's no contact visits, you know, with the phone, through the glass, and I'm visiting this person who I had seen before. He knew me, I knew him, and so on. He knew the organization. And we're talking, and he said to me, hey, would you call my mother, because he was from Philadelphia. And he said, would you call my mother and just tell her I'm okay? You know, well, you don't do that, you know, that's not allowed as a volunteer. But, you know, so I didn't say anything, of course. So about 15, when I finished the visit, you know, the chaplain, the head chaplain comes into the visiting room and he says to me, you're not going to call his mother, are you? So you knew right then and there, they were monitoring that call, that visit. It's like, he was an interesting chaplain, to say the very least.
Eric?
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about PBS's guidelines about not having any contact with the people you're visiting other than in that room? Like, you can't write them a letter, you can't send them anything, you can't
Right.
send them a book.
Yeah. You should even, this is a visitor, you visited for about, what, 10 years?
10 years.
10 years at FCI Fort Dix, New Jersey. You know, and she would go, and every day it's about, what, an hour trip or so?
It's an hour trip, and I had 5 visitors, so I
5
always
prisoners.
did one after another.
Yeah.
So-
Just an amazing person.
Pardon me. It was music that brought me in, just like you. Can I tell that story?
Yeah. and maybe
My
we should-
husband is an opera singer, and he was in an opera about a prison. And it was written by Sister Helen Prejean. Everybody knows who she is? And it inspired me to do this. I thought, this is for me. And it worked out. And that's how I met Eric. It was a wonderful experience. I'm glad I did it. I recommend it.
So your question again, so I don't,
About PVS was insistent that you not have any contact with the people outside of sitting in that room. And that always struck me as confining. It seemed like you could do more good if you were allowed to write, but you're not.
Right.
And I just wondered
well, that's
what's
prison,
behind that.
that's prison policy. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, remember, the visits that we experienced with federal and military, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons is much stricter about its volunteers than the states and the county jails. Very strict. So that if you run afoul of any of their rules, you're out. There's no second chances. You're bounced out. And some of the rules of the Federal Bureau of Prisons are, you know, you're going in and you're visiting there and you have no other contact with the prisoners. That's just the Federal Bureau of Prisons rule. And you either accept it or you don't. And if you don't accept it, you're not getting in. They'll just say, no, you're not coming in. So that's what really led to it happening that way. There are some programs for people, especially when they're getting close to getting out, where there are people who come in and they do mentoring and so on and all that stuff, and those are very good things. But it's a different association, it's a different relationship. When you're going and seeing a person month after month, year after year, maybe even decade after decade, you can't have these things happen. In all the 40 years of my experience with the organization, we had only one time where we had some sort of problem on the outside, so to speak. And this was in Lompoc, California, from the penitentiary, and this prisoner escaped. He escaped, and he called his visitor up because he was desperate. You know, he was on the run, and we had to counsel the visitor and say, don't you dare, you know, we know you care about this person and all that stuff, but, you know, you'll be an accessory to crime and all this kind of stuff and all that stuff. That's the only time in 40 years that we ever had something like that happen.
How did he have the phone number?
Oh, listen, you don't give out anything like that, but people have, they're just smart. You know, prisoners aren't stupid. They figure out how to, you know, and look up and all that stuff. Today, of course, it's even easier.
They know your surname, they know your full name.
Well, even if, all I know is that somehow or other he found her number in whatever way.
I mean, I know it's not hard to find somebody's number.
Today it's much easier, of course, you know, with the internet and all that stuff. But at that time it would have been, you're right, it would have been much more difficult. But, you know, he was desperate. So he somehow or other found the number and called. And of course, thank God she called me and said, hey, guess what? You know, and, you know, the normal thing could have been that somebody could have just said, hey, look, I know this guy, you know, and I trust him and all that stuff. I've had, you know, visiting him for years and all that stuff. But when you're on the lam, when you're running and you're desperate, you have to throw everything out, prior relationship out, because you don't know what somebody would do in that situation. And so that's the only time, though, that there's ever been something like that.
You said visits are usually about an hour. Give me an idea of what you would say to the person, besides how are you, are you being fed well? You know, if you get over the first 5 minutes of generalization, what do you talk about?
Yeah. Actually, would you like to come up and share that?
About how to talk to people?
Yeah, because you did that for 10 years.
I don't know if I'll remember exactly. Can you hear me without the
No, you
microphone?
need the
No,
No?
not really.
How is this?
Better.
Is this better?
Yes.
Too close?
No.
Okay. That's a tough one because I'd meet new people all the time, and so you had to kind of reinvent every time you met a new person. I had at any one time 3 to 6 people to visit in the short 6-hour day that it was. And you had to come up with something new each time. Luckily, I'm a person who likes to talk. Maybe that's not such a great thing for them, but it resulted in some deep friendships, surprisingly, that lasted for years. There were people that I visited for 6 of the 10 years, but they get moved around a lot. Generally, if you just ask a leading question, they'll talk to you. They want to talk. You know, there's so much that they can't share with anyone else. Even just the logistics of their lives there, what it's like for them to go through what they have to go through, just to be admitted to the visiting room, it's not pretty. And there's so much shame attached to their being there that you'll find sometimes they just want someone to express their simplicity to, their humanity, because you've got to be so circumspect in the prison. Anything you reveal about yourself is a way to get hurt, to get beat up or accosted or plotted against. Believe it or not, it's really rough in there. Sometimes I think it's worse than being in the regular everyday world. So they're not inclined to share because they don't have a safe opportunity to do so. So that seeing you becomes a way to be for at least half an hour a human being who's not seen through the lens of the crime that they committed. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I would just start off generally just saying, you know, hey, how you doing? People will often take it from there. Now, there would be some prisoners who were very quiet, and you had to kind of pull things out of them, you know, but first of all, again, we never force people to have visits. They have to want to be visited. They request the visits, or they may be referred, but, you know, it's not like they're being forced to have a visit. So they're already, you know, having some kind of interest in wondering, you know, what is this person, you know, this visitor going to be about? And of course, you hinted at, for example, when a prisoner goes into the visiting room, they're strip searched. When they leave, they're strip searched for contraband and so on, weapons, whatever. So a prisoner has to really want to have a visit, it seems to me, to go through that routine, because those strip searches, I've never had to have that myself, thank God, but that's got to be pretty humiliating to have that strip search. Understandable, I mean, why the staff do that, but a prisoner has to be able to say, this visit's going to be worth it enough to me to go through that strip search. So there's some motivation. Some of the prisoners they're just checking it out. They've just figured, hey, what do I have to lose? You know, come out. Others really, you know, are really wanting to do that. There's another local visitor who's actually still visiting here in Philadelphia when the jail lets them go because of COVID and all that stuff. And he did 19 and a half years in prison. And then eventually came out. He's been out now, I believe, 17 years now. And he visits at the Philadelphia Detention Center. He eventually was able to do that. And he understands and knows why people want to come out and have a visit, because he went through that himself, and it changed his life when he was getting these visits.
I think in my mind, the primary goal of the entire incarceration system should be to return people to society, have them get out, have them be able to return to life. But there's a huge problem with recidivism. People are rearrested, recommit, reoffended, and it's a great segue from what you just said. I would think that what you're doing is making a major contribution to people being able to get out and maybe have more confidence, more faith in yourself, and maybe not recommit. Do you have any, I don't think you have a story about that, do you have any feelings about that or any insight into that? Because I think that would make you one of the primary contributors to the goals of the system.
Well, first of all, at one point in this country, rehabilitation was what the prison system said and important. I don't feel that that's the way it is today. Things of course, things go up and down, on going, being very harsh, having no programs, having programs and so on. But I think today, the whole question of rehabilitation or people coming out better, at least let's put it this way, it's a mixed bag. I don't think that all prison officials and all prison systems, have that in mind. But assuming, as you do that, they do have that, there are things that can make a difference. Having, prisoners being able to work and learn a trade, learn education, those are important. Getting visits, these are all positive things. And the more that prisoners can have positive things, the better chance they can have when they're coming out. And I'll give you an example. My colleague, Barbara, and I met with this warden at the Supermax in Florence, Colorado. He was a pretty hard-nosed warden. He was very much sympathetic to our program. But anyway, there was a particular prisoner that we visited who had killed people on the outside, he had killed people on the inside. That's why he was at the Supermax. But this prisoner appreciated the visits and so on. And the warden said to me, he says, "Why do you visit this guy? He's really bad news. He's done all these things." And we'd say, "We understand, your perspective." He viewed, this prisoner visits you as the enemy. You're the police, as they call it. The prisoners would call the staff. You see the bad side of these prisoners, and they have bad sides, or they wouldn't be locked up. We get to see, when we're lucky, their good side. Because they see us, they trust us, they'll talk and share and all that stuff. And the more often a prisoner can get to express his or her good side, the better chance that when they come back out, maybe they'll, do okay. And most prisoners, eventually do get back out. There are some who don't, but the majority of prisoners do come back out. And how do you want them to be when they come back out? So I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but the more positive things you can give to people, at least you increase the odds that they're going to come back out and do better. It doesn't guarantee, and there are going to be some prisoners who, no matter what you do, are just not going to change. But I do think that those who see people coming in and treating them like the prisoner that Jeannie Graves, mentioned, and he said, "She treats me like a human being. Why am I acting like an animal?" When you can have somebody just realize that, that's mind changing, it seems to me. But that's one at a time. It's not the whole system.
That's right.
Me again. Has there ever been a problem with a prisoner getting out and then like maybe living in the same area and seeing their visitor and trying to get, have a relationship?
Actually, no, and the reason is that if this were visiting in the Philadelphia prison system or even the Pennsylvania system, that might be much more of a something happening. But because this is the federal prison system, the odds are that people, when they get out, because remember, there's 122 federal prisons scattered across the country, and the odds are that somebody's going back to their home, and most prisons do go back to where they are their home. It's not where the person who's visiting them, is there. So generally speaking, can't say 100%, but generally speaking, that is one of the saving graces, so to speak, of visiting in the federal or the military prison systems.
I guess about 5 years ago, I was in a group at my parish in Germantown. And we were together once a month for September to May. And then at the end of this program, we were to go to one of the prisons on State Road because one of our priests was a prison chaplain. And I think it might have been 4 females and 2 guys. So he said, well, there'll be some X number of guys there. He said, when the guys found out there would be more women than men, more prisoners came to the mass. And our priest that was the prison chaplain, he asked several prisoners to do the readings that day. And when it was time for petitions, right after sermon, they were very moving what they would say, things that were real for them. And number 2, my brother Paul worked for PBS.
Yes, a long time ago.
He was a visitor in the office.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And he still lives in Germantown.
Yep, I see him walking around the streets.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Did you have a question too?
I did, but actually your answer to the first question, I think answered it. I was wondering why federal prisons. I was wondering why, or are there other organizations that visit more like state and
Well,
local?
the reason why Prison Visitation and Support, PVS, visits in federal and military prisons exclusively, not state prisons or county jails, is because of the founding reason of this organization. This organization was founded officially in 1968, but was the 2 co-founders wound up visiting people on their own prior to that. But the organization was founded to visit conscientious objectors and those folks only would be in federal or military prisons. If you refused the draft, for example, you go to federal prison. If you were in the military and refused, you would go to the brig or to the military facility. And that was because the founders were, part of the whole Peace Church, Quakers, Brethren, Mennonites, and then some other groups there. So that's why it was, and so they said, we want to visit people. Well, where are the people? They were in federal or military prisons. And then as things continued, of course, they weren't just visiting conscientious objectors, they were visiting anybody, but they had the entree at those systems. And with 122 federal prisons, and the federal prison population is down, but at one point it was over 200,000. I forget what it is now, but you're still, too many people who aren't getting visits, and so they didn't go to visit in the state or the county. But that's why. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Would you talk about the conscientious objectors, the visits with them? I was very interested because Mary Angela had that written up in the summary. And I thought that would be very interesting to know.
Mhm. Well, visiting them, and I visited, of course, some of them. That's how I started. In some ways, it's very similar to visiting any prisoner because you're locked up and you're wanting to talk to people. But on the other hand, people who were, doing time for refusing to go into the military, kind of were saying, "I'm going to prison." It wasn't like people did something and then they got thrown into prison. They were deliberately, saying, "I'm refusing and I know I'm going to go to prison." So there's a little different kind of way in that regard. I would say that conscientious objectors pretty much were better educated than other prisoners. They had connections on the outside, because in the most cases, family or friends supported them in doing that. So they got letters, for example. There's lots of prisoners that don't ever get letters from anybody. Conscientious objectors tended to get letters from people. And in fact, I know in talking with some of them that some of them got stacks of letters, so many, right? And they would actually take their letters and share it with other prisoners, just so a prisoner got a letter. I mean, so it's a little bit different. But on the other hand, the things that they face in prison, are pretty much the same. And in fact, there were some prisoners who weren't conscientious objectors, who resented the conscientious objectors, and some of them tried to cause harm. There was a book I read, I'm trying to remember his name now, it was called From Yale to Jail. And he was a very famous leader in the peace movement and so on, who did time in federal prison and talked about the times when he was threatened by other prisoners and so on, and had to protect himself and so on. So I would say that there's some similarities and some that are different, because they tended to be more organized. They tended to, as I said, have more support on the outside. They were voracious in getting books and reading and so on and stuff like that. That's at least my experience with visiting them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to give you a little. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you all being here. I have a few copies of his book in the back if you are interested in picking it up. I can definitely help you with that. Thank you again. Thank you, Eric, for being with us. See you all next time. Have a great day.